Before I share today's message with you, I want to say a very sincere thank you to you who are part of the Christ Lutheran Church family in Libby, Montana. It's been my great privilege and sacred honor to serve as your interim pastor for the past 12 months. Jill and I are so grateful for the way that you received us and welcomed us, prayed for us, encouraged us, and made us feel a part of your family. Since we own a home on Bull Lake, we will continue to keep our church membership here, and we have every intention of coming to worship with you as often as we can. For now, though, I just say thank you. Thank you for a wonderful year full of good memories, experiences, conversations, and for your trust. Today's message, my last one as your interim pastor, is based on several verses from the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. St. John writes, "The Jews began to complain about Jesus because he said, 'I am the bread that came down from heaven.' They were saying, 'Isn't this Jesus, son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I've come down from heaven'?" Jesus answered them, "Do not complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh." If you haven't figured it out by now, I love surveys and top 10 lists. In fact, I'm a sucker for a good top 10 list on just about any imaginable topic. And you've probably noticed that I often incorporate those lists into my sermons. I was especially intrigued when I found this top 10 list the other day. The top 10 phrases to avoid using if you want to write a movie script. Now, how could I not look at that? It claimed to be a list of the most annoying and overused one-liners in Hollywood movies, and I have to say it's a very interesting list. But I'll just give you the top 3 in reverse order. Number 3, the things I do for my country. Many have said it over the years in the movies, but Vin Diesel somehow seems to have said it in just about every movie that he's ever made. Number 2, I've got to get me one of these. You usually hear those words in a spy movie or a sci-fi movie, like when Will Smith saw what the alien fighting weapon could do in Men in Black. "I got to get me one of these," he said. Flynn Rider said it in the Disney movie Tangled, when he discovered the benefits of all things, a frying pan. And here's the number 1 line you should never put in a movie script if you're thinking about writing one. The short version is YJDGIDY. The longer version is, "You just don't get it, do you?" Apparently that is officially now the most overused line in Hollywood movies. Dr. Evil says it in an Austin Powers movie. Martin Lawrence says it in Big Mama's House. It's spoken by Stanley Tucci in The Devil Wears Prada. Marissa Tomei delivers the line in My Cousin Vinny. William Devane says it in Payback. Rambo says it. John Travolta says it. James Caan says it. Owen Wilson says it. It's in the Terminator movies. It's in Bounce. It's in The Rookie. It's in Toy Story, and in many, many, many other movies, which apparently is why you shouldn't use it next time you make a movie. It's already been used way too much. So now you know. Avoid using YJDGIDY. You just don't get it, do you? Well, if you can't use that line in a new Hollywood movie script, I am going to at least use it in this sermon. I just think it would have made a great line in the arsenal of Jesus, don't you think? Imagine how many times he could have used it. He never does, of course, but don't you think he must have been tempted? So often in his life and ministry, people just don't seem to get it. it happens again and again and again in just John's gospel alone. And it's not like John doesn't warn us in advance. In fact, at the very beginning of the gospel, 10 verses in, John says that Jesus was in the world and that the world came into being through him. But then look what he says next. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. In other words, they didn't get it. As the gospel continues, again and again, people don't get it. At the beginning of the 3rd chapter, when Nicodemus came to Jesus and Jesus talked to him about being born again, what did Nicodemus say? He wondered how it was even possible for a person to go back into their mother's womb and be biologically born again. Jesus could easily have shook his head and said, "YJDGIDY, Nick. You just don't get it, do you?" 1 chapter later, Jesus meets a woman at a well. He tells her all she has to do is ask, and she can have living water that will quench her thirst forever. What does she do? She wonders how on earth he's going to get water out of the deep hole in the ground they're standing next to when he doesn't even have a bucket. She has no clue whatsoever that Jesus himself was living water. 1 chapter after that, Jesus could have said YJDGIDY to the paralyzed man lying beside a pool, who thought that healing, true healing, could only come from jumping into the water at the precise moment it started bubbling. The man couldn't fathom the idea that healing could come from the very one who was standing right in front of him. John's entire gospel is filled with stories like this, of people who just don't get it. Today's story, it's the Jews. At least that's what the first 2 words say. John wasn't trying to say that all Jews didn't get it. He simply meant that certain Jews, for whatever reason, did not want to accept what Jesus said. And sure enough, right away they start complaining. Jesus tried his best to offer them pure grace, to tell them about the living bread that came down from heaven, and even more, that he was that living bread and that what he was promising could be theirs. But they just didn't get it. Instead, they insisted on sticking with what their eyes and human experience and past history told them. Isn't this Jesus, that kid whose mom and dad are Joseph and Mary? He can't possibly be the living bread from heaven. Besides, what is living bread anyway? Bread is something you eat, and then a couple hours later you're hungry again. Jesus, he can't be that. Jesus wanted them to hear something life-changing, and for it to be personal for them. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, he said. But they just didn't get it. I have to say, though, I can't blame them for having a hard time with that. Never mind the eating part, which is difficult enough. It's the forever part that gets me. Forever is a long, long time. It's difficult enough to grasp the concept of forever, let alone the notion that somehow I might have the chance to live forever. I remember when the space vehicle Curiosity landed on Mars 8 years ago this month. I still can't wrap my head around it. How is it possible that human beings can send a spaceship 352 million miles to another planet and land it with pinpoint accuracy in a manner that involves the biggest supersonic parachute ever made, a giant crane that lowers the 2,000-pound rover exactly 66 feet at precisely 2 miles an hour before dropping it gently and perfectly onto the surface of Mars as the parachute and crane whisk themselves out of the way? That's crazy. One scientist described it this way, quote, "It's like trying to shoot a speeding bullet with another bullet while wearing a blindfold and riding a horse," end quote. Unbelievable. In so many ways, that's what the claims and promises of Jesus were like, to those who encountered him in the Gospel of John and elsewhere. They can't be true, can they? They seem way too fantastic. Did you know that 92% of Americans say they believe in God? And yes, that's another one of those statistics I love to quote. Actually, 92% is pretty good. Even 20% of atheists say they believe in God. Now, I'm not sure how that works, but hey, I'll take it. 80% of Americans believe in miracles. 50% of Americans say they pray at least once a day. 85% of people in this country believe there is such a thing as eternal life. But here's the thing. Even though the vast majority of people say they believe in eternal life, only 52% of people say they will personally get to live eternal life. In other words, they believe in the concept. They believe theoretically that what Jesus is saying about living forever might be true, but they don't necessarily believe it's true for them. What more can Jesus do to make us understand? I can hear him saying even now, you just don't get it, do you? Jesus wants more than anything for you to believe his words. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And not just believe the promise, but believe that it's true for you. It's so hard sometimes to see and accept that the promises of Jesus are personal. Recently, a woman told me she had a life-changing revelation. When I asked her what that revelation was, she said that for the first time she realized that Jesus didn't just die for us. Jesus died for her. She had always professed the words, but for whatever reason, she had never taken them personally. The promises and the grace of God are personal. They're for me, and they're for you. Being this is my last sermon with you, I want to take a risk. I want to share with you a story that I've only shared publicly once before. I've resisted telling this story because it's the kind of story they teach you in seminary not to share in a sermon, because it's way too mysterious and speculative. Besides, it's very personal and it's frankly hard to tell. So I've resisted sharing it. But I share it with you now, though, because I want you to hear it. My story comes with a caveat. What I'm about to tell you is either astoundingly true or fantastically fiction. And I admit there's no way to tell which it is. You'll have to decide for yourself, but I can tell you this. It's an experience that played a huge role in defining who I am and who I will be for the rest of my life. Here's my story. My father was a supreme pessimist and a skeptic. He definitely wasn't what you would call a religious man. Yes, he took our family to church every Sunday morning when I was growing up, but I'm sure it was more out of a sense of obligation than anything. Mom said we should go to church, so Dad took us to church. I don't think he doubted the Bible's promises, but I'm also pretty sure he didn't regard them as being personally for him. At the age of 70, my father was diagnosed with cancer and given only a few months to live. When he entered his final days and hours of life, my 3 brothers and I took turns sitting by his bedside, tending to whatever needs he might have. For the most part, Dad just slept. But every once in a while, he would open his eyes and have a short conversation. He was always very lucid when he talked. One January night, actually in the wee hours of the morning, when he was especially sick, it was my turn to sit beside him. Suddenly he sat up in bed, which he hadn't done in many days. He looked with his eyes wide open toward the foot of his bed. Without saying a word, he reached out his hands. 10 seconds later, he lay back down and closed his eyes. I said to him, "Dad, what is it? What's the matter? What was that about?" He looked at me with a surprised look, as if he had forgotten that I was in the room with him. He didn't answer. I asked him again, "Dad, why'd you sit up? What were you reaching for?" He turned to me and said, "Didn't you see?" "See what?" I said. "No, Dad, I didn't see anything. Tell me." Again, he closed his eyes and just lay there. I kept pushing him. Dad, tell me what you saw. What happened? With his eyes still shut, he said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." I begged him to try me until finally he did. He said somebody had just come and stood at the foot of his bed. When I asked who it was, he said he didn't know. He was still surprised that I hadn't seen it myself. I asked if he was afraid or if whoever it was scared him. "Oh, no, he said. It was wonderful, incredible, loving, peaceful." "Well, did this person say anything or want anything?" I asked. "Oh, yes," Dad said. He said everything would be okay and that it was time for me to come with him. And then my dad looked at me and added this, "I think it was an angel." I sat there stunned and speechless. I was amazed that these words were coming from the lips of my father, the ultimate pessimist and supreme skeptic. When I finally had enough presence of mind again to speak, I told Dad it was okay to go, that I loved him, that he obviously had a wonderful home waiting for him in heaven, and that I would see him again someday. Less than a half hour later, my dad took his last breath. You know what was so odd about all of that? I didn't grieve when he died. Yes, I was going to miss my dad, but based on what we had just experienced together, I was filled with such an incredible sense of peace and joy for him. In my mind's eye, that angel had come back. This time, Dad said yes, and now he was in the home Jesus personally prepared for him. There was no more cancer or pain. There was no more suffering. He was in a place more wonderful than I could ever imagine. Like I said, it's a pretty fantastic story, isn't it? Did it really happen as my dad said it did? I have no idea. Did an angel come to see him that night, to personally take him to his home in heaven? I don't know. I know that I didn't see any angels. What I do know is that my dad came to have a sense of peace about him that I had never seen in him before. My dear friends at Christ Lutheran Church, I am not asking you to believe my story, nor to believe in angels, nor to believe that somehow angels personally come and speak to us. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. What I am asking you to believe is this stunning promise. Jesus said, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever." I'm asking you to take the giant leap, if you haven't already, of believing and trusting something so remarkable and fantastic that every ounce of human experience suggests that you not believe it. I'm asking you to be the one who gets it. Trust that this promise of Jesus is true, and more importantly, that it's true for you. Thank you once again for giving me the great privilege of being your interim pastor. May God give you and your new pastor, may God give us all the kind of faith and certainty that God's love and promises are not only rich and full, but very, very personal.